Okay, so I'm really honoured to give this inaugural lecture in your seminar series on historical and international perspectives of the Colombian health system. And this is what I want to address. I'm going to start with a very brief definition of a health system, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. I'm then going to consider how health systems differ across the world. Can we categorize health systems in a useful way to compare between countries? I'm then going to ask the question, not how do they differ, but how should they differ? How can a country draw on international experiences and learn from others? And then I want to end by a comment on the public health system that COVID has really shone a light on. And to my mind, this is the neglected dimension of health systems. So first of all, what is a health system? I take the standard WHO definition, which I think is suitably broad, which is all organizations, institutions, and resources that produce actions whose primary purpose is to improve health. And note, it's primary purpose, not a secondary purpose. So that then defines the boundaries of the health system. I like to use this way of depicting the health system because it's both simple and comprehensive. This sets out the four main actors, the population and patients who receive services, engage in services, the providers of services, and then the financial intermediaries or the agencies in an intermediary role, and then, and then the government and professional bodies. And so the detail of this diagram shows the flows of services and money between them, whether that's direct or indirect payments to the providers of services in return for the services that people receive. And it also shows the regulatory role of the government and professional bodies. I think this does have a somewhat economic dimension to it because it focuses on the flows of services and payments, but I think this is helpful. So moving on to the main functions of a health system, this is the standard WHO categorization that is very, very commonly used. Financing has three main elements: revenue collection, pooling, and purchasing. Then there's service provision, there's the resource generation, the training of human resources, the building of physical capital, pharmaceuticals, and so on, and stewardship, including regulation. I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on the financing function before moving on to the bigger picture of the health system. So the financing function. I like this diagram from George Shiva, who worked at the World Bank for a long time, because it sets out very clearly the three main elements of the financing function. On the left-hand side, the revenue collection, then the pooling, and the resource allocation and purchasing. And on the right-hand side, George Shiva includes service provision, but that's the sort of final bit. It's not conventionally defined within the financing function. So on the left-hand side, you have the revenue collection and the various sources of finance to a health system categorized by whether they are public sources or private sources. And then I quite like this diagram for the pooling column, this one in the middle, because it depicts quite how complex these flows of money are between the sources of finance and then the intermediaries that allocate that money. And I'm not going to go into that complexity. I'll say a little bit more about that later. And so the sources of revenue are pooled by these agencies that have the role of resource allocating and purchasing, which is the third of the financing functions. Those intermediaries may be government agencies like the Ministry of Health. They may be social insurance or sickness funds, They may be private insurance organizations, employers indeed, and then the individual households, which make their own decisions on what services to purchase, where they use their own funding. But this source of funding from out-of-pocket payments going direct to providers is, of course, not pooled. It bypasses the pooling process. So going on to talk first about sources of finance, this is relatively recent data taken from the WHO Global Health Expenditure Report. And this shows the makeup of health financing by the main financing source and by country income group, and over the last 8 years or so. And really showing a surprisingly stable pattern, actually, over the years, with a few exceptions. So I think the shading of these graphs makes the pattern very visible, that low-income countries, one finds a high share of out-of-pocket payments. That's these bright red bars. As country income increases, this share falls. So out-of-pocket payments make up a smaller proportion of total health expenditure. But I've always found it quite interesting how slow the out-of-pocket payment in general is, how slowly it falls by country income group. Obviously, you have variation between individual countries, but it's not until countries really reach upper middle income and indeed high income countries that the out-of-pocket share becomes relatively small. But again, interesting to note that even in high income countries, there's still a not insignificant share of out-of-pocket payments. That's reflecting two main drivers. One would be individual choices, paying out of pocket for things like pharmaceuticals, for example. And the other is reflecting government policy or health system policy on requiring payment for particular types of services or co-payments. So in the UK, for example, we have a free national health service, but there's a contribution for drug prescriptions. So the other trends shown in these graphs, obviously this bright green is the share of external aid. You'd expect that to be high for low-income countries and to rapidly decrease as countries grow richer. But the aspect I want to particularly draw attention to is these dark blue bars and then the lighter blue bars that join them. And these are the compulsory or the mandatory elements of health system financing. They're the government transfers in dark blue, that's the income from government taxation. And then in lighter blue, that's the social health insurance contributions, the payroll taxes. And you can see that those are very small when countries have a low income. They gradually rise with being more significant in upper middle countries and then very significant in high income countries, especially when one pools both government transfers and social insurance contributions. So a very clear picture here is that as countries grow richer, they choose to mandate a much higher share of health system expenditure. And this is recent OECD data. It covers the countries in the OECD. This shows total health expenditure as a percent of GDP. It may be a bit difficult for you to read the legend, so just to clarify that these round circles are total health expenditure as a proportion of GDP. These diamonds are government and compulsory health expenditure, that's taxation and social health insurance and payroll tax. The cross is voluntary insurance, and then the square is out-of-pocket payment. And just since I'm speaking to Colombia, I show you there. Again, I think the takeaway message to me is that as countries grow richer, then a much higher proportion of the contributions to the health system are mandated. But you can obviously see some outliers, whether in terms of the proportion of mandated payments. I was quite interested that Portugal is quite an outlier in terms in terms here, with a relatively low share of mandated payments and a high share of out-of-pocket payments. So that's the picture on the revenue side. When we come to the pooling arrangements, we see much greater complexity and diversity. And I've picked up a few elements here that differ between countries. One of them is the number of pools. Does a country have a single pool, like we have in the UK in the National Health Service, for example, or does it have a different number of pools? For example, particularly in a country like Germany, where historically insurance has been linked to employers. In general, there's been a tendency for countries to move to larger and fewer pools. So the Republic of Korea, for example, has moved from many sickness funds on the German model to one single large insurance scheme in 2000. One of the reasons why countries make this change is because multiple pools can mean differences that are considered inequitable between the pools, whether that's in terms of levels of health need, levels of public subsidy, or levels of health expenditure. So, for example, in Thailand, and I'm going to refer to Thailand quite a bit, partly because it's a country I know really well. This is their universal health coverage scheme, very widely publicized across the world, because Thailand implemented this when it was still a lower middle income country. There's one very large universal health scheme funded by general tax, covering nearly 48 million of the population and all age groups. There's a social security scheme that was introduced before the universal health scheme, which is an employer-based scheme with equal subsidies from government, the employer and the employee, covering about 12.5 million workers. And note that scheme covers the workers only, not their families. Those are in the universal health coverage scheme. And then a civil servant medical benefit scheme, which is non-contributory, paid out of general tax, covering just under 5 million. And this special scheme for civil servants is not unusual across the world. When Thailand introduced universal health coverage in 2001, the Act provides for the merger of these funds, but it's not something that Thailand has been able to achieve, largely for political economy reasons, I think, to say it in a simple way. But you can see that what there is a significant difference in spending on the scheme, just as one example of differences between the schemes. So, for example, the ratio in spending per member between the civil servant medical benefit scheme and the universal health scheme is 4:1. So 4 times more money is spent on civil servants via their scheme than it is on the general population covered by the universal health scheme. And note that for these 2 schemes, they both cover all age groups, unlike the social security scheme, which only covers the workers. And in fact, you can already see that there must be quite an inequality between the universal health scheme and the social security scheme, because you'd expect the working population to have much lower health needs than a population covered by the universal health scheme that covers the elderly and children as well. So just to conclude on pooling arrangements, 2 further issues in terms of country experiences. Another is whether or not they use market mechanisms in the insurance fund arrangements. For example, do they allow individual or household choice of insurer? I mean, the insurance may be mandatory, but there could be choice within that. And related to that, whether or not countries use risk equalization mechanisms, because the risk of allowing individual choice is that it provides the insurer with an incentive to minimize the risks of the pool that they acquire. And you can get pools that may have a much higher risk population than another pool, and therefore higher levels of expenditure. So a country like the Netherlands, which does allow some competition, has a risk equalization mechanism to cream off money and equalize it across the different pools. So I'm sure, because in Colombia you have quite a complex arrangement involving different insurance funds for different populations, I'm sure that we may get into some further discussion on these approaches. And then the resource allocation and purchasing arrangements, again, a series of questions, a series of issues that differ across countries. One is, how is the purchasing decision approached? Is it a formal purchasing decision, or is it essentially a matter of patient or provider preference? So does the health system regulation leave it to patients or providers to determine what health services are needed, what interventions, or is there central control and regulation? And then where there is central control or regulation, what emphasis is placed on cost effectiveness as a prioritization mechanism? Or indeed, is financial protection given equal or greater emphasis in those decisions on service provision? So in the UK, for example, with the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, we have a very strong regulation concerning cost effectiveness, not always applied absolutely consistently, but generally the National Institute for Clinical Excellence is essentially the rationing, the prioritizing mechanism for deciding on the decision on whether or not to adopt new drugs or technologies. Somewhere like Thailand, additionally, emphasizes cost effectiveness, but interestingly, there are few examples where Thailand has been influenced by financial protection. So the decision to include renal dialysis in universal health coverage was driven by a concern about the impact of renal dialysis on household expenditure, that decision was made in recognition that it fell outside their cost effectiveness criteria. There's then the second big question about how should interventions be purchased. Should countries have a management hierarchy that manages the service delivery, like a classic traditional Ministry of Health? Or should there be a purchaser-provider split with competitive contracts awarded? And similarly, how decentralized should be decision-making? Should decisions on interventions be made centrally or regionally, or left to local level decision-making? In the UK, we've had an attempt to introduce competitive contracts and local purchasing, but it's constantly come up against the ethos of a national health service. And we have a lot of comments on what is called postcode lottery, the dislike that whether or not you have access, for example, to a particular cancer drug could be influenced by the postcode you live in, rather than being a national decision. And that's a constant tension within the National Health Service. And then, of course, the question of what payment mechanisms you use in purchasing interventions. Very, very important in terms of influencing service provision. And finally, from whom should interventions be purchased? What scope do countries allow within a purchasing mechanism for there to be freedom of purchasing from all types of providers, including private profit providers, or is the purchasing arrangement essentially within a system of public ownership of healthcare? So, at the risk of really gross generalizations, I've put here, to end my summary of the financing function, something about what I see as typical health financing structures by country income group. So in low-income countries, you tend to find limited government funding from tax, plus external funds, plus high out-of-pocket payments. Pooling is mainly for those who can access government services, those provided by a Ministry of Health. And there tends to be a hierarchical management for public services with very limited use of contracts. In middle-income countries like yours, you tend to have quite a complicated mix of general tax subsidies, payroll tax, voluntary insurance, out-of-pocket, pools that are often fragmented, though a number of countries have made significant progress towards universal coverage via merging pools. And then there tend to be separate arrangements for the different pools in terms of purchasing and a mix of hierarchy and contracts. And then by the time one gets to high-income countries, one sees a high share of mandated funding, relatively low share of out-of-pocket payments, universal coverage almost everywhere, and very often with single pools. And within recent decades, increased use of this division between purchase and providers and introduction of competition for service provision. So just to note, in my own country, it seems our current government is beginning to back away from the emphasis on markets that we've had in the past. So the question now, I've really just talked about health financing function. So, well, what about the health system structure as a whole? And here things get really difficult. If it's difficult to classify countries based on their health financing structure, it's even more difficult to produce a classification based on the entire health system. And I show you here one developed for the OECD in 2010, which I find is quite interesting. It classifies countries at the highest level by to what extent they rely on market mechanisms or not. And then where they rely on market mechanisms, it characterizes them in terms of whether they involve private insurers in basic coverage, or whether the basic coverage is covered by public insurance. And then within public insurance, there's a further distinction on what happens about coverage beyond basic coverage, whether there's private insurance beyond basic coverage, as is done very extensively in France, or whether there's little private insurance beyond basic coverage. And my admittedly very out-of-date knowledge of Colombia is that you probably encompass both of these together in your arrangements, which just illustrates that countries don't fall neatly into these categories. And then if you look on the right-hand side, mostly public provision and public insurance. The OECD chooses to distinguish countries then on the basis of whether they have a gatekeeping role. That means whether the primary care level acts as a gatekeeper to access to hospitals. So like in the UK, I can't go straight to a specialist at hospital. I go via my general practitioner in my primary care practice. So they're countries that are primarily public provision and public insurance, but where there's no gatekeeping and a lot of choice of providers, like Sweden. Countries which do have gatekeeping, some with limited choice of providers, but a rather soft budget constraint. And then there are countries that allow a lot of choice of provider, but within a strict budget constraint, which is an effective way of keeping the cost down, as in, for example, the UK. This categorization system, you can see, reflects very much an economist's point of view, given the sort of role that market mechanisms play in determining this categorization. But before moving on, I want to emphasize that economists aren't the only discipline that have a view on health systems, and that there is an evolving body of literature addressing health systems as social institutions. For example, my colleague Gilson, who's conceptualized health systems as complex geopolitical institutions based on different sorts and sets of relationships, like the patient-provider or the employer-the-employee. Health systems within Europe are commonly referred to as a visible manifestation of social solidarity, a really important indicator of the social compact. And this comment has been made also with regard to post-conflict countries and the importance of governments in post-conflict countries like Afghanistan, for example, being visibly engaged in supporting their health system as a way of demonstrating their concern for their population. And then there's also been work on health systems as a means for embedding human rights. So, given the focus of your seminar series, I think it's interesting to ask, how can a country make sense of this? There's a lot of documentation of country health systems across the world. As I've indicated, there's such huge diversity, it's difficult to conceptualize that diversity. So I find it helpful to think about what are the sorts of aspects of a country's context that helps them think through what sort of health system design or reforms are appropriate. And I want to talk about 4 aspects of that: the economic structure of a country, the strength of political, economic and social institutions, the management capacity in the public sector, and issues of political economy and path dependence. So first of all, the economic structure. There are many things I could talk about, but I want to focus particularly on the nature of the labour force and on income inequality. So the implications of the nature of the labour force obviously relates to the role of social health insurance and the fact that many countries, as they grow richer, have chosen to adopt a social health insurance model rather than, at least early on in the trajectory, rely on general tax funding as the majority source of funding for their health system. But you face the issue that the formal employment sector is often small in low and middle income countries, obviously in low, but often in middle income countries as well. So Thailand, for example, has about 35 million people in the workforce, but just over a majority in the informal sector. And that was a big reason why they chose general tax funding. And so social health insurance schemes, inevitably based on the formal sector because of the payroll tax structure, cover only part of the population. And while they may have provision for voluntary enrolment of the informal sector, this is usually a small take-up. So what you see are strategies like subsidizing enrolment in the social health insurance scheme for the informal sector or for lower income groups, either partial or indeed full subsidy, or introducing separate tax-funded arrangements for lower income groups. In terms of income inequality, some of the implications of that, one is the segmented healthcare systems I've referred to already, the fact that there are different funding pools for different population groups and different services used by different population groups. And this is especially a problem where those funding pools relate to different employers or different segments of the economy that may be of very differing levels of wealth. The greater the income equality, the greater can be the challenges in incorporating everyone into one universal scheme. And I'll be interested to know about those sorts of challenges in Colombia. For example, in Thailand, I've referred already to the opposition to merger of the 3 schemes. And that's a fear, particularly amongst the civil servants, that their benefits will be restricted if they're in one scheme. I spent quite a bit of time with colleagues in South Africa looking at the scope for national health insurance in South Africa. South Africa is really an outlier because it's not been able to implement a national scheme. And that's a lot to do with the existing arrangement of voluntary insurance based on employment, which is very difficult to widen to other groups. And I'm going to say a little bit more about South Africa in a moment. And then there's the question of whether a country should allow or require high income groups to opt out, as in, I think it's, is it Germany or the Netherlands, where higher income groups don't fall within the compulsory arrangements and are required to self-insure or can opt to self-insure. And sometimes a country may provide tax relief to households purchasing voluntary health insurance, partly to cope with the pressures you get in a scheme that is universal, and yet where people may have their own individual ability to pay for a different quality of services. This is work we did in South Africa with collaborators there, trying to assess the degree of willingness of the population to cross-subsidize other groups. Since in essence with universal health coverage, that's what you will be doing, at least to some extent, and you certainly would be doing it if you're paying from general tax. And if you look at the richest quintile here, the bottom line, you'll see that their preference for a payment approach, almost half of them preferred payment for healthcare that would be proportional to income, a quarter payment that would be progressive, but only just over 15% would be willing in such an arrangement for the poor not to pay anything. And as you may expect, the poor, that was the poor's preferred arrangement. So I think this just indicated, at least for my colleagues in South Africa, some of the barriers in South Africa to achieving a universal scheme which encompassed all income groups within the population, when you didn't have the degree of social solidarity that would make it possible to negotiate that sort of a scheme. So a bit more briefly on the three other features, my second country characteristic was the strength of political, economic and social institutions. I suppose by definition, the less developed a country, the weaker are its political, economic and social institutions. For example, governments may face fewer pressures than in a more open society to devote enough health resources to the poorest. There may be issues about the professional ethos of health workers. For example, capitation payment depends on an ethos of health providers that they don't minimize services. We have evidence from Thailand that private providers paid under a capitation arrangement did indeed perceive an incentive to minimize the provision of services, an incentive that didn't impact so directly on public providers. So that was where you saw a difference in how public providers and private providers responded to a capitation payment structure. And my point here, without going into the details, is simply that health system reform needs to reflect institutional constraints. And the sort of practice in the past of borrowing reforms from one country and inputting them into another tends to ignore the institutional makeup constraints in a particular country. Moving on to management capacity in the public sector, I think this is again a rather neglected topic, but the sorts of health system arrangements that countries may put in place make different sorts of demands on public sector management capacity. Some examples are shown here. For example, we know that countries that introduce social health insurance often have problems enrolling all employers who qualify, that the capacity to enroll employers is the capacity that may not fully exist. Policies are often not effectively implemented. For example, the old recommendation that countries impose user fees plus exemptions for the poor, and yet in practice, countries often were not simply able to implement an effective exemption system. And also there may be a pervasive problem of lack of information. For example, it's impossible to regulate the private sector adequately without a database of private providers. So my point is that policies need to take capacity to implement into account. And just to illustrate that with this example, we did some work some time ago on whether or not government should contract out the provision of health services to the private sector. And we looked at this in a number of countries. And out of a number of country case studies, we drew these conclusions relating to capacity. That at the top here, government capacity to manage contracts is a different sort of capacity from that required to provide health services. It requires a rather more sophisticated capacity. Indeed, it's a capacity that high-income countries may lack. Just look, for example, in the UK, the fiasco over security for the London Olympics, where the army was brought in, the fiasco over train franchising by the government. So it's not easy even for a well-developed country to manage contracts to the private sector. Far more difficult for a country with weak public sector management capacity. But also the decision on contracting out is also a matter of comparing the efficiency of the government provision of services and the efficiency of the private sector provision of services. And it's not taken as given that the private sector is necessarily more efficient. It depends on the capacity of the private sector, the nature of the private sector, indeed, whether or not they regard the government as a good payer or not. If they don't regard the government as a good payer, they may not even be interested in bidding. And then obviously government capacity for service provision varies a lot. There are some countries with quite well-run government health services, others where those are very poor. And then in general, the environment provides constraints as well, whether they're functioning legal and banking systems, procedures resistant to patronage or corruption. So this really just helps one think about the issue of capacity and public sector capacity and how it might factor into which health system arrangements are better or worse. And then finally, issues of political economy, path dependence. I don't have a lot of time to go into those, but clearly each country will have its own layout of different interests and stakeholders within the health system. There may be external influences that give rise to a certain lack of country ownership of policies that may be implemented. But also historical experiences constrain current choices. And that's the notion of path dependence, a notion used a lot by historians. For example, it's hugely difficult for any British government to fundamentally change the National Health Service. It's embedded in UK society. And I had a PhD student who looked at the dominance of hospitals in China. You may not think of China with its history of barefoot doctors as being a health system that is hospital dominated, but actually China has struggled to strengthen primary care. And one can trace back to the late 19th century how hospital dominance was established really early on. And that the periods of primary care dominance, particularly barefoot doctors, was an exception to what has been a continuous trend in the rise of the power of the hospitals. And this was using a path dependence framework to try and understand that. Right, so drawing to a conclusion, I wanted to make some concluding comments just relating to COVID-19. It's difficult in this era not to take it into account. The obvious point is that it's been superimposed on health systems already under pressure. But I think we always look for silver linings in difficult periods, and I think a silver lining is definitely that it's highlighted the importance of the public health element of the health system: surveillance, case finding, health behaviours, vaccination, and so on. The health systems frameworks I presented early on do encompass public health. They're very broad. But if you look at the health systems literature, it's very focused on personal health services, primary hospital care, and their financing, provision, and regulation. And the literature on the public health system is really quite limited. I think it's clear it's strongly influenced by constitutional arrangements. For example, the distribution of powers between central government and local government, because some aspects of public health are centrally a concern of local government. But the arrangements for healthcare and public health are not necessarily the same. For example, local government has a key role in public health in the UK, but does not have a role at all in health services. And there's also variation across countries in what functions are considered within government scope, and indeed are considered acceptable in government scope, such as wearing a face mask, for example. And just to give you a feel of what I'm thinking about, there's been some recent exploration and comparisons in the European Union. And this is taken from a book on the organisation of public health in European countries. And I think it's quite interesting to look at this with an eye to the COVID response. So in England, post a reform some years ago, we have public health moved from the National Health Service to local government. And local government has responsibility for planning, commissioning, and delivering local public health services. And it was that structure that the government chose to bypass in its development of testing and tracing capacity. And there's increasing criticism of central government for having done that. And that happened partly because we have a very strong central public health organisation in Public Health England. In France, there's no formal local organisation and limited activity at local level. In Germany, however, Germany has strong local public health offices, and a considerable amount of their success in the early COVID response has been attributed to the activities of these local public health offices. But in many ways, I think public health services are even more complex than health services and personal health services. This is a US CDC diagram of all public, oh, sorry, I've got a typo, private and voluntary entities that contribute to the delivery of essential public health services within a jurisdiction. And because public health services are so broad, you can see that the number of local entities are absolutely huge. And these are so little explored in terms of the funding and the relationships between them. So I'll end by a comment that I think COVID-19 does present an opportunity to reconceptualize health systems and to strengthen research on neglected issues, and especially public health functions. And I think it requires all countries to reflect on how they govern, finance, and provide essential public health functions. So to my mind, this is a new, interesting, and exciting challenge to health system researchers across the world. Thank you.
Okay, Anne, thank you very much for your presentation. It was a wonderful opportunity to have an overview of the healthcare systems on a global basis, which raises a lot of questions about our system in Colombia, because we tend, at the local level, we tend to be very, very extremely critic or cynical about our healthcare system. There is a strong opposition from the one side to the system, but from other people working within the system, or not necessarily opponents to the healthcare system, there's still a lot of criticism all the time. So looking from a global perspective, it doesn't look so bad, which is not surprising, because usually your neighbor's grass is much better than yours. So this is a typical problem of the neighbor's grass. But I think there are some strengths in our healthcare system. One is the pooling characteristic. Our health system, as compared to the other ones that you mentioned, like Thailand or the other ones, Colombia has a very, I can see that Colombia has a very, very high level of pooling, because at least 95% of Colombians are all, the collections of all that finance the health insurance for all these 95% of Colombians, all these resources are pooled in a single fund, which is, I think, a very major achievement of our healthcare system. So given that point, we just check it. The next question would be, how are those resources distributed through the healthcare purchasing agencies? In our case, they are health insurance companies, private or private for profit or private not for profit. So there's when the problems come in, because there is such a fragmentation between something like 56 insurers, and these insurers at the same time, they contract out their services, the delivery side or the provision of healthcare services, with provider networks, providers that are private or public. And there is also a lot of fragmentation there. So it comes as a contradiction. Given that we had been so successful in pooling resources, which allows us to protect, to guarantee financial protection to all the households. We will talk about that later. But given that we achieved that high level of pooling, it is unfortunate that on the purchasing and the delivery side, such pooling does not reflect in a real sort of coordination or less fragmentation, at least in contracting and delivery. Do you have any comments on that? Because I'm curious about this contradiction.
Yes, and I think it's a real challenge how you allow a degree of choice to individuals, how you link the different levels of healthcare, and what level of coordination do you assume? Do you, for example, link your primary care services into a hospital network? Do you have what we call a district or an area coordination of all services within a network, or do you allow this more competitive pressures? Do you try and encourage competitive pressures such that there's some competition between different hospitals or different primary care units? And I think there's a sort of pendulum that countries go to one extreme and then gradually they adapt and go to another extreme. So I said in the UK that we over a number of decades, governments have introduced an internal market, have required there to be a contracting process. Hospitals have been made autonomous through trust status. And now there's a much stronger emphasis on linking them together and having a more centrally planned approach. So I have no answer, but I think that modern medicine does require us to be joined up in terms of structures that support individual patient care. And as the problem of chronic disease gets more and more, as you get a higher proportion of the elderly, thinking through how to make sure that there's joined up care across primary, secondary, and social care is really critical. And then whether you can structure that around disease networks, for example, or around allocating responsibility to a single network in a single geographical area. I think you have to think through all sorts of possibilities, but there's no easy answer to that.
Okay, so I was reflecting on the competition on the delivery and the insurance side, which is another point that you raised. Our experience in Colombia shows that competition may lead to relevant market failures because, healthcare is full of market failures all over the place. On the insurance market side, we have seen that competition has led to biased selection. Yeah. Why? Because enrollees tend to stay, they tend to stay with their current insurer as the default, but when we release data about quality of the insurers, the only ones that move or that switch from one insurer to the best one are those who are high-risk individuals. I mean, the small group of risk individuals that move to the winners make this winner a loser in reality. So it's like a winner scores problem. So it seems that insurers do not want to compete to be the best because they will attract a higher than average risk. Yeah. So on the insurer side, that's one problem. And regarding the provider sector, in the provider sector, easily measured proxies of quality, such as structure, process, and outcome indicators, do not adequately penalize the poor performers or reward the good performers. So you can have still a very complex mix of poor performance and good performance. So an outcome data on health outcomes are very difficult to extract and very difficult to convey to the public in a manner that adequately stimulates value-based competition. Then it seems that the competitive approach, both on the insurance and the provider sides, is full of traps and is full of difficulties. And apparently it has not been able to increase the performance of the healthcare system overall. How do you analyze this situation as compared to other countries that have also tried competitive approaches on the insurance and on the provider side?
Yes, and I think that when there were the original sort of models that proposed the competition on the insurer side, in general, there was a lot of doubt across the world about the value of it. There were some brave countries that tried it. Obviously, Colombia, Argentina, I think, Netherlands. It still remains a debate amongst economists. I hear the International Health Economics Association still has sessions on private insurance and so on. But I think the mainstream of health economics is quite has always been very doubtful as to the value of encouraging competition between insurers, primarily for the reasons you say. Number one, that it's difficult to control the incentives for the insurers, and number two, because households find it difficult to be informed purchasers. I always remember Uwe Reinhardt from the US giving an amazing account at, I think, an IHEA conference on looking at the documentation for the differing plans of the different insurers and saying the huge amount of paper and having to read through it. And if he had difficulty in making sense of what the different plans were and the differences between them, how could someone who was less well informed of the issues do that? So I think it doesn't surprise me that there are problems with getting an insurance market to operate. I think, the basic economics theory one teaches argues that insurance markets are not standard markets. So I think there's I don't know enough about the experience of countries that have these arrangements. I'm not sufficiently up to date on what's gone on in the Netherlands, for example, to know, but I suspect in the Netherlands it operates with a strong degree of regulation. On the provider side, I think the economists are rather more open to using the pressures of competition to try and encourage efficiency in the provider side, but still very skeptical about I suppose the ability and willingness of individuals to really make choices, and also about the degree to which providers themselves respond to those incentives. And although we've had attempts to create a competitive market in the UK on the provider side, it's been made quite problematic for two main reasons, I think. One is outside London, there's often a local geographical monopoly of a hospital. You have a large hospital in the main county town, and so there isn't really a choice. And the other is that within London, where you do find a lot of hospitals, there's political economy reasons why it's difficult for hospitals to go out of business or to fail, because in the end, the government will see a lot of pressures from constituents of MPs to intervene and sort it out. So the tendency in the UK has been much more to use regulation and measures of performance to try and bring sort of information to bear, whether that's in England. You can look at any hospital and there's a system of appraisals by patients, a system of benchmarking a hospital against others. But also even there, there's a lot of attempts to get good data on quality, and a lot of evidence that things like standardized mortality rates and so on for hospitals are not reliable indicators. So I agree that there's all countries are struggling with this. And again, you see a pendulum swim between introducing some competitive pressures and then pulling away and providing a more centrally regulated one.
Okay, I understand the skepticism about competitive approaches on the insurance side, as you have mentioned. But I wanted to make an additional point, and it has to do with the pandemic. During the pandemic, there's a structural weakness of the competitive healthcare systems, health insurance system, and it's because the the competitive approach creates population silos by insurer, but these population silos are mixed at the community level. So when public health interventions require community-based interventions, so it's based on the whole geographic area and not on the particular enrollees of a single insurer. So we have seen this conflict well before the pandemic, but the pandemic it make this more visible at a more larger scale. What is your recommendation? I mean, I understand it's obvious your recommendation on strengthening public health is indisputable, and after the pandemic, it became absolutely clear. No one would deny that. But how to make it more compatible with an insurance scheme that is based in population silos? Given that in Colombia, if we decided to keep the competitive health insurance approach, we still have the challenge to match that approach at the community level for public health purposes. What do you suggest in that regard?
I think one thing that's important is to identify the boundaries of what falls within what services the insurers are required to finance and what things are done by other entities. So that presumably, even in Colombia, not all of what one might include within public health would fall under the remit of an insurance arrangement. Presumably, it's more the personal preventive measures and so on. So I think you might need to, one option to think about is whether there are things that fall under the remit of the insurers, but actually should be taken out of that. And you should be shifting some of the functions around in the way that the UK, I don't think this was necessarily a good idea, but it chose to move certain functions out of certain health promotion and health prevention out of the NHS into local government. But, I think you need to think about what are the public health arrangements you need on a population basis at the local level, where those are provided from at the moment, how those are fragmented between whatever the municipalities do, for example, and what the insurers do, and then whether you should shift any of those boundaries. That's one thought. Okay.
So there's a question from the public that I want to pick because I have prepared some quick. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes, it's just about to come up.
Okay, so the question is from Camilo Noreña, and he says, vis-a-vis the pandemic, would you like to elaborate on the results between healthcare systems, public healthcare systems, and other healthcare systems with a high participation of the private sector, specifically regarding procurement and application of vaccines? I would like to have a wider view of this question, not only focus on vaccine procurement and application, but on healthcare system performance overall. There were two publications in the Lancet recently measuring performance of healthcare system based on one indicator of health access and quality and another indicator of effective access. And let me just show you this very briefly. This is well before the pandemic, back in 2016, 2017. So we see a very low correlation between healthcare access and quality index, which measures if people are treated effectively for their diseases or if interventions, health prevention and health promotion interventions are adequately performed. So if we compare this indicator with the deaths per 100,000 population, this is taken from the Johns Hopkins database, I see no correlation at all. This is a very basic and preliminary analysis, but it shows something. There's no correlation between the healthcare access and quality index. And even if we take the 100 countries with the highest mortality, we still see no correlation, even lower. The interesting thing is that this correlation is positive, not even negative. And we can see that Colombia here, regarding this indicator, is it's right in the middle, like as compared with other Latin American countries. We are right in the middle. Probably the best ones are Chile, Uruguay, Cuba, and Costa Rica. But there are many others below Colombia, and there are a couple of the largest ones in the same range of Colombia. And the other publication was measuring universal health coverage effect on effective coverage, which means that if when people need healthcare, do they actually achieve or receive the care they needed? And they used an indicator of avoidable deaths, or what proportion of avoidable deaths I mean, how high or low is the proportion of avoidable deaths, given that the individual had certain disease or medical conditions. And then here we see a very similar correlation with COVID-19 deaths per 100,000 population. When we see the whole set of 192 countries of the paper, we see that effective coverage has no correlation whatsoever with the main outcome of COVID-19, which could be deaths per 1,000 or deaths per 100,000. There's a very low correlation coefficient, which is positive, surprisingly, and the same. If we take the 100 countries with the highest deaths per 100,000 population, there is also a very low correlation with a positive indicator. An overview of the world, Colombia is not that bad here. In this case, we are in an upper range as compared to Latin America. We are even better than Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, and Ecuador, and other countries in the region, probably similar to Cuba, not as good as Costa Rica, but we are not that bad. And back to my first question, I mean, looking to the Colombia case from a worldwide perspective, it doesn't look so bad. And the interesting point is, I checked the correlation between these two indexes, the effective coverage index and the healthcare access quality index, and they're very, very correlated. So they are probably taking account of the same characteristics of healthcare system, both on the quality and access of healthcare services that people are receiving, and the effective coverage in terms of what percentage of avoidable deaths if it is low or high. So there is a high correlation between these two indicators, which indicates that these two indicators look at the healthcare systems from two different perspectives. And the conclusion is that no healthcare system was prepared to face the COVID pandemic. So there is a tendency at the local level to say that our system is a failure because we were unable to face the pandemic. We had a lot of failures, some successes, of course, but the common understanding of many people is that we have to reform this healthcare system from the basics. But looking at the international figures, it doesn't look that bad, as I said before. What do you think? Is there a real trend in the world, or a clear pattern that tell us what is the ideal type of healthcare system through the lens of the COVID-19 crisis? All health systems were stressed by the pandemic, as you clearly mentioned. But is there a structure, an ideal structure of healthcare system to deal with this pandemic?
I think that's a hugely challenging question. And in fact, I actually, for a short while last year, was discussing with a colleague. We were invited to put a paper on COVID and health systems to a journal, and decided not to, because we decided it was just too complicated and too unclear. And that was sort of later last year. But even now, it's difficult. I mean, I have a number of comments. I think one is those interesting graphs you've showed, to me, just show the weaknesses of a reductionist approach to the health system, because in a way that, none of the, whether it's the UHC effective coverage index or the healthcare access and quality index, they're an extremely imperfect representation of all of the dimensions of a health system. And I think what's particularly interesting in the case of COVID, and maybe not exceptional for a virus like COVID. I mean, it needn't be this particular one, but it taxes so many different elements of a health system. I mean, from intensive care, for example, through to ability to deliver vaccines. And I think that, through all the health promotion, health protection stuff as well. So I think that so my first point is that it just echoes how inadequate these indicators are. Secondly, I think you need to, in terms of thinking about a country's response to COVID, you need to think about the different elements of that, of which the health system is only one. It goes back to this classic problem in linking the health status of a country to its health system, that there are many other determinants and many intermediary influences. And so there are also things like, well, for example, in developed world, the social care system, which, you know, we may see the health system struggling to cope, but quite a bit of that was the consequence of what happened within the social care systems in countries, whether it's Canada or Sweden or the UK, where we saw a huge rise in cases in care homes. And that was related to how the hospitals dealt with those, and how the cases had to be dealt with within the care homes. So that's one complicated element. I think another complicated element is just the fact of it being an infectious disease, and therefore you get the dynamic of rapid escalation of cases, and the fact that there's been a huge emphasis on efficiency and managing the capacity of hospitals, and yet this requirement for surge capacity is not factored into current health systems. And indeed, you know, from a public point of view, and indeed from a private point of view, would be seen as a huge inefficiency if you had under occupation of your intensive care unit to a significant extent. So I think there needs to be a lot of creative thinking about how to structure and finance and incentivize that sort of capacity, and simply going out and building huge new hospitals is not the solution. And of course, you then have the problem of health workers, which has been a huge problem in the UK. You know, there was this big development of new hospitals, but they've not been effectively used because the existing services are so overwhelmed with all health workers involved in those. And then there was another point I wanted to, and then, yeah, and so if you look at the UK, we have two contrasting examples, again on the lines of the health system is only part of the issue. You have the example of the initial response and the test and treat system, where the UK dismally failed. I think you'd hear very few defendants, and it was embarrassing coming from the UK with the strong national health system to see the mess that was made of that. And yet you now have the UK's vaccination programme rolled out, covering over 30% of the population, having covered all of the age groups above 60. I myself have had the first dose of the vaccine, as had anyone else in my age group. And that was political, you know, well, I think there were two things going on there. One was it was a political issue, and the other is that years of government that had cut back local government, not given enough resources to the National Health Service, meant that there simply wasn't the capacity within the public sector to respond to the need to deal with the huge rise in the need to test and trace. And therefore the government contracted companies to do that, because the private companies were offering to do it and had the sort of capacity to mobilize the flexibility, the willingness just to go out and buy tests, buy human resources, buy in lab workers and so on. So there's, and then of course there's the attitude of the government towards personal protection, wearing of face masks, lockdowns and so on, which I don't think initially was handled at all well in the UK. So I have no answer, and I think there will be, you know, it's an incredibly fertile source of further cross-country comparisons to try and understand how different countries have done well. But I think, as with many things, you need to look beyond the health system, because it's not just the health system itself that's the issue.
Yeah, I understand that. In fact, in a couple of papers that you shared with us previously, you mentioned the issue that there is I mean, there are many political issues around the success with the pandemic, but there's one very important that has nothing to do with healthcare, and it is the trust between government
Yeah.
and the public.
Yeah.
Let me just show you these figures about Latin America that were published by ICLAC a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
So these figures show how the share of people who have very low or no trust in government, although it decreased during the last decade, the previous decade, the 2000 to 2010, it increased during the last decade. And even though the poverty level decreased dramatically during that same period, and then the middle class increased, this is whole Latin America, and the poorest decreased rapidly during that same period. But look at these figures. This is satisfaction with healthcare services, and you can see that collateral or correlated with that lack of trust in government, the satisfaction with healthcare system keeps going down, while in the OECD countries, basically Europe and the rich countries of Asia and other Southeast Asian countries, it's still very high. So it seems to me that the pandemic put an additional stress on these figures, because probably the trust in government will not come back, and even it will worsen, because all these figures will be reversed. I mean, this middle class will go down and the poorest will go up. So trust in government will go down, and the whole healthcare system will be put an additional stress that was probably exacerbated by the pandemic. So do you think it's a phenomenon that we could see in other low-income or middle-income countries, or this is very particular to Latin American countries?
An interesting point. I think certainly the Latin American continent has some, particular constellations of issues of government and health services and poverty and so on that make it particularly challenging, I think. And I haven't seen this trust data before, but I think I'm trying to think. I suppose there may be some parallels in Eastern Europe with the collapse of the Soviet Union, when levels of trust in government with the economic reforms and the sort of ending of the huge centrally planned health systems led to really low levels of trust or there have been really low levels of trust in government. It's, I know, made very difficult in some countries the development of collective mechanisms for healthcare led by government, because the population simply don't believe that the government is capable of acting in the interests of the population. On the other hand, the Central European former USSR countries are such a different set of countries in their own right that I don't think comparison is necessarily very easy. But I mean, I'm impressed by that diagram relating to Southeast Asia and trust in government, because clearly in the work I did with my Thai colleagues, there has been quite a high level of trust in government and willingness to follow government public health regulations and so on. But to what extent that's also a matter of traditional culture and political culture and a more different social and cultural norms in parts of Southeast Asia, countries like Thailand and Korea, Japan, than is the case in Latin America. I think this is where things get really interesting, because it goes way beyond the issues of the health system and much more to do with the political, social, economic issues of countries and their historical levels of development.
Okay, there are a couple of points from the public that I want to address before finishing our interesting conversation. One is regarding the source of funding. In Colombia, we still have a large share of our funding from payroll taxes. Mm-hmm. And we have struggled for decades with informal sector economy. At this moment, for example, Colombia has around 50% of its labor force in the informal sector. Mm-hmm. So it's very hard to enroll them in the contributory scheme, which is the one based on formal. Mm-hmm. So the subsidized scheme has to be kept even though when we first devised the reform back in the early 90s, we expected that by year 2000, the subsidized scheme would only cover 30% of the population or less. At this point, we have a larger share in the subsidized scheme for the informal sector than for the formal sector. So there seems to be a tension, a trade-off between raising payroll taxes, which is a very safe source of revenue, but at the same time at the cost of informality. Do you have any experience of other countries that have overcome this contradiction, or do they have managed or devised different financing schemes that reduce their dependence on payroll taxes?
Well, I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, it's not just the fact that the payroll taxes give an incentive for employment to be less formal, but it's also secular trends in the nature of the workforce, the gig, what we call the gig economy. You know, Uber and all of the other sort of emphasis on self-employment and so on, which is, I think, generally regarded as a long-term trend. So, and then of course, with an aging population, with a higher dependency ratio in the economy, you've also got the workforce, you know, those in formal employment bearing a higher responsibility for elderly dependents to be or the retired to be paid for. I think what you see is an increase. What you see across the world is a decreasing reliance on payroll taxes, for the reason that as the structure of employment changes, as countries don't want to make themselves more uncompetitive because of loading healthcare costs onto the workforce, you see a greater use of other sorts of funding, primarily tax funding, because from tax funding you have a broader tax base and a broader range of contributions, which are not tied to employment, only to employment. So countries, I think, have what you see is that the proportion of government transfers either remains very significant or rises, or some countries have actually switched from a payroll tax system to a government-funded tax system. Okay. Or thinking about other ways of, I mean, I think in Korea they use other sorts of taxes, whether it's property taxes, though those are not so popular, or sort of locally based taxes rather than the sort of national ones. But I think I think it's inevitable that countries like Colombia will have to place less reliance on payroll taxes.
Okay, one last question, and first of all, let me thank you very much for your decision to stay with us for late. It's early evening. It's early evening in London, so we really appreciate that you have decided to stay with us for half an hour more. There's one last question regarding, there's a whole debate in Colombia about a right-based approach, a human rights-based approach to healthcare versus the market-based approach. And part of the weaknesses of our health system is its lack of legitimacy vis-a-vis the human rights-based approach, because it has been criticized. I mean, the healthcare system has been criticized as a very, very profit-driven one. So most people are skeptical or cynical about the profit motive of insurers and providers themselves. So some of them suggest that we should move back to a more publicly oriented and I mean less for-profit or profit motivated healthcare sector. This, yeah, you know, this has been a very long discussion for decades, back like a pendulum, like you described it earlier. But what do you think about that situation? Is it really bad to be to have a profit-driven healthcare system, or does it really? I mean, is there any evidence that it has increased efficiency as opposed to a mostly public driven system? Is it a much better option for middle income countries or for the Latin American context? Do you have any comment on that?
My sense from the literature is that while there are some studies that indicate that for-profit ownership can increase efficiency, it's very dependent on local circumstances and local arrangements. You equally see countries where it's not been possible to make that link. I mean, I think the general view of the literature, for example, on whether in the UK making hospitals autonomous and introducing a competition for contracts that may have had a marginal effect on improving efficiency, but the benefit wasn't worth the cost of managing that system, you know, the transactions costs and so on. That to manage a competitive arrangement, to manage, especially where you have a profit motive mixed up in it. I mean, the profit motive is intended to drive the efficiency, but it's very difficult to control that. And of course, it adds a layer of cost above what you need to run the service. So within a public system, you need to cover the cost of running the service. If you contract it out to a private profit company, you have to pay a margin to provide a return to that company, and that then makes the cost more expensive, and you need to recoup that in terms of improved efficiency. My sense is the evidence is, or that there is very little evidence that that it's worth paying that sort of profit element to get that the cost of that profit element tends to be more than the efficiency benefit received. But I think I go back to the point we discussed really early on, that the basis of that argument is that healthcare, health insurance or healthcare can operate according to the rules of perfect competition, and we know perfectly well it doesn't.
Yeah.
But also that the direction you want to go in depends on where you are, in a sense, because if you have a very heavily centrally planned, rigid, bureaucratic public system, you may well want to free that up a bit, allow a bit of competition at the margins, and you may gain from that. Whereas if you're already in a position, and you know, at the other extreme, if you already have a highly profit-driven system, you probably want to regulate and introduce a greater degree of organized planning into it, and that things are always, you know, you can never stand still. You need to adjust as you go at the margins and as you move forward, and constantly readjust, but hopefully without too much major reform, because as we know to our own cost in the UK, major reform comes with such huge costs to the system that it takes decades to recover from.
Okay, Anne, I recognize that I would stay with you for hours discussing these interesting topics, and I apologize with the public for not having all the questions brought to you, but given our time constraints, it is very unfortunate for us that we have to bring this conversation to an end. But first, I wouldn't finish my intervention without giving you a very, very strong thank you for your time, your interesting insights, and hopefully this seminar will bring a lot of thinking or a lot of reflections to improve our healthcare system. But I think this international perspective has given us a lot of inputs that we can use to make a better and more nuanced analysis of our healthcare system. So thank you very much. Jairo is proposing that we give you a round of applauses with the cameras. Jairo, are we doing that? How can we do that? Well,
quienes tengan uso de la cámara, por favor, le encienden y le ofrecemos un aplauso a Anne por su maravillosa conferencia.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure and very interesting. Thank you.
Okay, have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great. It's a great presentation.
Thank you.
Jairo, ¿quieres hacer algún comentario final? It's a closing comment from Jairo.
Para todos, invitados para nuestra próxima sesión en 2 semanas. Sabemos que a lo largo del semestre nos veremos jueves de 12 a 1:30. La próxima sesión discutiremos los temas relativos al Estado y el mercado en relación con la provisión de los servicios de salud. Contaremos con el profesor Jorge Iván González, quien estuvo en la Universidad Nacional, y Ana Sojo, quien estuvo muchos años en la División de Desarrollo Social de CEPAL, quienes tendrán sus intervenciones sobre el tema del Estado y el mercado y las encrucijadas de la salud pública en América Latina. De modo que pronto tendrán ustedes la invitación actualizada a las distintas sesiones del seminario. Y gracias, Ramón, de nuevo por tu moderación y exposición. Fue espectacular este rato y poder tener esta conferencia magistral como la soñamos. Ya Ann Mills nos deja unos puntos clave sobre cómo entendemos un sistema de salud, cómo este pasa por una serie de aspectos relativos a sus funciones, pero cómo debemos considerar el nivel de desarrollo de los países. Y deja también unos interrogantes que se estarán respondiendo para el caso colombiano de cómo este ha respondido a la pandemia y cuáles son los posibles ajustes que a la luz de la evidencia internacional puedan realizarse. De modo que bienvenidos todos de nuevo. Estaremos discutiendo estos temas con distintos expertos nacionales e internacionales. Y agradezco también al profesor Carlos Agudelo y los colegas de la Universidad Nacional, quienes en buena hora nos han hecho esta invitación para unirnos, economía de la salud y salud pública, a generar este espacio de debate académico que considero de mucha importancia. Profesor Carlos, por favor, tiene usted a cargo la despedida de esta primera sesión.
Bueno, a todos los participantes, en el mejor momento estuvimos conectados 302 personas, que es muy satisfactorio para nosotros, y esperamos que sigan participando y mostrando interés para este tema tan importante. Próximamente, como decía el profesor Restrepo, le haremos llegar la agenda completa del seminario. Y nos encontramos aquí en 2 semanas para retomar uno de los más interesantes temas de Estado y mercado. Muchas gracias y que pasen un feliz fin de semana.
Thank you very much.
Gracias a todos. Feliz
Thank
noche.
you. Feliz noche. Chao.